everybody, my name is Julianne and today I'll be reading Mr. Bump by Hargreaves. This is the sad story of Mr. Bump. The trouble was that Mr. Bump just could not help having little accidents. If there was something for Mr. Bump to bump into, he'd bump into it all right. For instance, if you were to see Mr. Bump out walking down a street in your town and if there happened to be something to bump into down that street, then you know what would happen, don't you? Mr. Bump was just the same at home. One morning he noticed that part of the chimney had come loose in a storm the night before. "I must fix that before it falls off," thought Mr. Bump to himself, and he hurried to his garden shed to get a ladder. It was a very long ladder. Mr. Bump walked up the garden path with the ladder on his shoulder. He turned the corner of the garden path. Crash went the living room window. "Oh dear," thought Mr. Bump, and he turned to see what had happened. Crash went the kitchen window behind him. "Oh dear," thought Mr. Bump again, and he rested the ladder against the wall of the house so that he could climb up on the roof to mend the chimney. Crash went the bedroom window. So you can see how Mr. Bump had his little accidents. Mr. Bump had many, many jobs, but somehow they never seemed to last very long. As soon as anything got lost or broken or splintered or chipped or snapped or cracked or torn or bust or wrenched or crunched or split or slit, Mr. Bump got the blame. For instance, when Mr. Bump worked on a farm, he tripped over the farm dog and split the milk which he was carrying for the farmer's wife, and which the farm cat lapped up. For instance, when Mr. Bump was a bus driver, he fell off the bus and couldn't catch up with it. For instance, when Mr. Bump was a carpenter, he found that when he was hammering nails, he hammered his thumb most of the time and the nail hardly at all. So, in order to recover from the series of rather unfortunate happenings, Mr. Bump decided to take a vacation. There he could think about what kind of a job he could do where he wouldn't be such a nuisance to everybody. So off he went to the station to catch a train to the ocean. While Mr. Bump was on vacation, several things happened. For instance, he fell off the boat into the ocean and the lifeboat had to come and rescue him. For instance, one day when he was quietly walking along the beach minding his own business, he got his foot stuck in a bucket. Because he couldn't get the bucket off, he had to walk around with it on his foot for hours. For instance, another time he was walking along the beach. He walked straight into a large hole that somebody had dug, and he had to stay there all night because he couldn't climb out all on his own. However, despite all these little accidents, Mr. Bump enjoyed his vacation, and while he was there, he had a great idea about what sort of job he should get. It was the best idea Mr. Bump had ever had, an absolutely great idea. And now, Mr. Bump works happily for Mr. Barley the farmer. Mr. Barley has a large apple orchard on his farm, and that's where Mr. Bump works. Mr. Bump's job is picking apples, but he doesn't use a ladder to climb up the tree to pick the apples like other apple pickers. Oh no, Mr. Bump has a much better way of picking apples than that. He just walks around, and before long, Mr. Bump, being Mr. Bump, walks into a tree. Bump! Bump! Down falls an apple, and Mr. Bump catches it. This makes the job of apple picking much easier, and Mr. Bump is very pleased about his new job. And Mr. Barley is very pleased about his new apple picker. So you see, the story of Mr. Bump isn't such a sad story after all. And if you ever bump yourself, you know what to do, don't you? Go and eat an apple picked by Mr. Bump, and then you won't feel your bump at all. You'll remember that the next time you have a bump, won't you? Good. And that was Mr. Bump by Hargreaves.